When the Memphis Grizzlies first traded away Desmond Bane, I was pretty surprised. I was thinking back to a couple of years ago. They were the two seed in the West, led by a young core of Morant, Triple J, and Bane. And I thought if they just got healthy again, they could do something similar, especially with how there's so much parity in the West that they could get right back to that level. But now they've had a couple of days to really sit back and reflect on that trade and think about it from the perspective of both sides. And it's starting to make a lot more sense if you're the Grizzlies. Let's break it down. First of all, though, for Orlando, this was a trade that they obviously did because they needed some shooters on that team. Because if there has been one problem with the Magic for the past couple of years, there's not a lot of offense to this team, not a lot of spacing, really. And that makes Paulo be this pretty slow, ISO heavy scorer. And with that, it slows your entire offense down. So to add some spacing, that's what they were looking for in this trade. And with who they traded away, KCP, he was brought in to be a veteran, to be a floor spacer, and that didn't really pan out for him. For Cole Anthony, this is someone who I think honestly has quite a bit of potential that he hasn't tapped into yet. Is he going to be an All NBA player? No. But this is a pretty good scorer. And I remember in his sophomore season, there was a time where he was averaging 20 points a night. And with that, he was in conversations for the most improved player award. But by the end of the year, his production had declined quite a bit, down to 16 points a night, which was quite disappointing considering the start that he had. And he never got back to that same level yet. But now it's some fresh scenery for him over in Memphis. And with these first round picks, 4 first round picks, that sounds like a lot. And it is a lot. But they were ones that the Magic they can afford to give up. One of them was from this year. Another one had a lot of swaps attached to it, so even if it's a very good pick, it may very well not go to Memphis, from my understanding. And the other two being in the future, if Orlando banks on this trade and they did it right, those picks aren't going to be very good for Memphis either. So overall, those are kind of the motivations for the Magic. And then we get to the Memphis Grizzlies, the side which I was not so easily seeing their perspective. But let's think about the context of this team for a second. At first glance, yes, you've still got that core of Triple J, Ja, and Bane, or at least you did. And over the last couple of years, of course, Ja has had the off the court issues. He's also had injuries. And overall, this team has been pretty banged up, and they have not got to that same level of being the two seed in the West. But even if the stars aligned and they got back to that caliber, what's next for them? Because you look at the West, yes, there is a lot of parity there. And so Memphis, they could get back to that two seed if things went right for them. But what comes after that? Because at the top of the West, you have the OKC Thunder. This is a very young team that's probably going to go on to win the championship this year. And with that, they look like they have the potential to be the NBA's next dynasty. It will remain to be seen if that truly happens, but they have the talent to do so and the youth to do so. And so before the Thunder, the juggernauts in the West, they were the Denver Nuggets. And being at the top of the West, they had a target on their back. And the team aiming for that target was the Minnesota Timberwolves. They built a team around Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns that was designed to be able to shut down this Nikola Jokic oriented Nuggets team. And of course, you add in the superstar Anthony Edwards. They had a good formula to beat the Nuggets. But now the top dogs are the Thunder. And so now, if you want to have a chance to succeed, you've got to do the same thing, but this time respond to a different challenge in this OKC squad. And that's what it looks like Memphis is trying to do. And what they realized is this core of Triple J, Morant, and Desmond Bane, from everything that they have shown you to this point, that's not quite a championship squad. And that's not a knock on any of these guys. But I don't think it necessarily felt like they could beat the Thunder to come out the West. And so with that, you are left at a crossroads. You've got a big decision to make. On one hand, you can stick with the squad you've got and hope that maybe the Thunder, they succumb to injuries, or maybe they get upset by another team. And then you've got better odds. Or on the other hand, you can do something about it. You can make a change, not live in a cycle of continuous mediocrity, hoping that something can change, but instead enacting that change. And that's what the Grizzlies did. They recognized that they didn't feel that Big Three was going to be able to take them over the top. But now, with this move, they've got a little bit more flexibility. You've got these picks. You've got a player with some talent in Cole Anthony. You've got KCP, who looked to be in a little bit of a slump last year, but I think he can bounce back. And honestly, you have quite a bit of young talent on this roster, and we really saw that a couple of years ago when Memphis had all of those injuries. It seemed like the whole roster was hurt. You've got Vince Williams, you've got Zach Edey, Scottie Pippen Jr., Gigi Jackson. There's a lot to this team, and they could very much go down the route that the Indiana Pacers have currently gone on. In which, of course, Indiana, they are built around Tyrese Halliburton and Pascal Siakam, and everyone around them are very solid, very good players. But this team is led by a duo, and that has gotten them all the way to the point of the NBA championship, making the NBA Finals against the juggernauts of the West, the Thunder. And for Memphis, now they've got their duo that is solidified. Bane's not there anymore, so now it's up to Triple J and John Morant to take this team over the top, and they've got talent around them, much like Indiana. And the reasons for that decision is one, people follow the winners. There is a desire to replicate what those at the top are doing because maybe they're doing it for a reason and it's very effective, right? You look at the Golden State Warriors, they redefined the league not just because they were taking a lot of threes, but because they won and they were taking a lot of threes. And that's how we get to the point in the NBA nowadays where three-point volume is higher than ever. And so, with that, if Memphis is going to, as we mentioned earlier, take out the juggernauts in the West and the Thunder, they need to follow the winners, follow in the footsteps of a team like the Pacers, and try to replicate that formula and see if they can find some success for themselves, especially if they feel as though they can't find success with their current setup. And secondly, talking about success with their current setup, big threes, we're not seeing as many of them anymore, or at least sustainably. You think, especially with that second apron coming in, look at the Minnesota Timberwolves. They had a big three of Ant, Rudy Gobert, and Cat, and they made a shocking move by trading who could have been a franchise lifer in Karl Anthony Towns. But they had to do it to get out of a potentially rough financial situation. And so all of a sudden, that big three was no more because it simply became too expensive. Not because it wasn't successful, they made it to the Western Conference Finals, but because it was too expensive. And with that second apron coming in, you have to be more weary of that and recognize when a roster might be too expensive and to make the business decisions whilst also trying to maintain a winning strategy. And so that led to the Grizzlies looking at the roster and deciding that, this might get too expensive and they don't feel as though they can win right now. So they've got to move on from this big three and instead look to build around Triple J and Ja. And we'll see if that works, but they had to make a move, especially with the juggernaut in the West like the Thunder. They had to do something to feel as though they could compete and not be stuck asking what if, but instead enacting that change. And that is why the Memphis Grizzlies traded Desmond Bane. I was surprised at first. I think I was wrong about that. I think that there are some factors that made a lot of sense for them. They want to compete. They didn't feel as though they could do it with that current big three, and with all the financials setting in, they had to move on at some point, probably. They get some talent, they get some picks to add on with the talent that they already have, and they can build around Triple J and Ja, and they're working with a duo rather than a big three right now, which is just more at this stage, at the current timeline that we have in the NBA, more sustainable. And I didn't love the move at first glance, and at the end of the day, I'm no professional, but it is kind of becoming more clear why this trade was done. And that's the beauty of both first reactions and secondary ones, in which the first reaction might be a little bit more emotional, might be wondering why, but the second one, you can go more in depth on it, have a more nuanced perspective, take a more complex deep dive into a trade, and begin to see the real reason why the Memphis Grizzlies traded Desmond Bane.